I have a good friend who is getting remarried. Her first husband died tragically a number of years ago, and now she's met someone to start this next chapter of her life with. As it happens, he also lost his spouse tragically, and finding one another at this stage in their lives has brought a joy they didn't know they would ever have again. But even in the midst of all the exciting things in their relationship, there was something I noticed that she was processing as they got more serious. Taking two households and merging them into one is not easy. If she moved into his home, into the space and the rhythms he had known for so many years, how would she ever overcome the feeling that she was an outsider inside what was supposed to be her own home too? If you have ever merged households, you can relate to this dilemma. My idea about when and how dishes should be washed is different from my spouse's idea. What makes a good spice drawer or a garage storage system to one person does not mean it works for someone else. Or maybe think about students heading to college who had their own room for 18 years of their lives and suddenly find themselves needing to share a very small dorm room with a person from a different state who has unique habits and tastes, who has specific beliefs and worldviews. Even if you are the most open-minded and adaptable person on the planet, when it comes down to it, changing the ways you've always known, even for the sake of a relationship, can be really difficult. The book of Acts, in some ways, walks us through various stories of the early followers of Jesus, figuring out how, on the one hand, to preach and proclaim what they passionately believed about the teachings of Jesus, and on the other hand, figuring out what should be a give or take when it comes to the religious traditions that they had practiced and always known as Jewish people. Acts 10 gives us one glimpse into this. We read about a man named Cornelius, who was a centurion. He was a Roman military officer. And we know that Cornelius is identified as a devout man who feared God. Cornelius wasn't a Jew, like Jesus' disciples. He was a Gentile who, from what we can gather, respected some of the Jewish teachings, but not all of their customs or practices. And in Acts 10, we hear that Cornelius has a vision where an angel of God instructs him to send some of his men to the home of a man named Simon, where Peter, the disciple, was staying. Then the scene, it jumps to Peter, who is heading up to this roof to pray. Now, many houses that day had flat roofs with stairs that led up the side of the house onto the rooftop. So it was common that these would be places of relaxation or prayer. But on this particular day, we read that Peter falls into a strange trance. The Bible says he saw heaven opened and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals, as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke to him a second time, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." Again, we have to remember Peter was a Jew, and he was still culturally connected to the belief that some animals were clean and others were not. And this bizarre vision that he has seems to suggest that God was wrestling with Peter a bit, helping him to wonder about those divisions everyone, himself included, had set between Jews and Gentiles, between the insiders and the outsiders. The Bible says Peter was greatly puzzled by all this, by this vision, when all of a sudden these men of Cornelius's, they appear at Peter's door. So Peter says to them, "It's me, I'm the one you're looking for. Now, can you tell me why you're here?" And we read that they don't even really know. These men just knew that Cornelius, their boss, maybe their leader, their friend, we're not sure, had a vision and told him to send them here. And then we read in verse 23, Peter invited them in and gave them lodging. Now remember, these people are basically strangers, but more than that, they are Gentiles. And the interpretation of Jewish customs would have prohibited these two cultural groups from fellowship like this. It may sound strange to us today when we think about it, but this really would have been unheard of. The story continues with Peter traveling with these men back to Cornelius's home, and Cornelius was expecting them. We read this, that Cornelius had prepared for this meetup with Peter, a stranger in his land, someone from a totally different cultural group. And as they get to be talking, Peter acknowledges the awkwardness of this entire situation. You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile, but God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. Notice the second part of that verse. In Peter's vision, it was animals. It was not calling anything unclean. And here it's people. Peter recognizes God saying that he should not call anyone unclean. So what does this even mean as we think about relationships, hospitality to people in our lives? Well, merging households, whether it's with a partner or a roommate, it is difficult. In our homes or workplaces or churches, changing our traditions or our ideas about the right place for things or the best way to do things, it is harder than we want to admit. In Acts, for Peter, if he was ever going to effectively communicate the message about Jesus to all people, he needed to change the way he thought about who could come into his home at all. And for Cornelius too, we see that he was willing to listen. His friends were willing to trust a stranger opening his home to them. If you've visited a small town, you know that the struggle of insider-outsider language is real. I'll never forget coming to a restaurant in our small town when we moved here, enjoying our meal, getting ready to pay, and realizing they only took cash or checks. They looked at us like we were crazy not to know from the start when we pulled out our credit card to pay for our meal. And don't worry, I am a small town girl at heart. But set this silly sample aside and think about it. How can all of us in our towns, in our homes, in our churches, how can we look around and ask, what are the barriers that would prevent people from feeling welcomed or accepted? If we were to remove those barriers between the insiders and the outsiders, what kind of relationships, what kind of deeper faith could we even begin to imagine?